Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, and maybe drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. I never considered myself the adventurous type, but something about the crumbling old Riverton Asylum pulled me in. Located on the outskirts of my small town, it loomed like a forgotten relic of a darker time. My fascination with history and photography had always been harmless until that night. The asylum was notorious for its history of overcrowding and mistreatment. Locals swapped stories of how patients were abandoned when it closed in the 1960s. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I did believe in documenting forgotten places, and the asylum felt like a challenge I couldn't resist. My best friend Mark tried to dissuade me. "This is stupid," he said, scrolling through a list of urban exploration fails on his phone. "People die in places like that. You could fall through the floor or get trapped." I laughed, brushing off his concerns. "It's just an old building." The plan was simple. Sneak in, take some photos, and leave before midnight. Equipped with a flashlight, my camera, and sturdy boots, I parked my car a quarter-mile from the asylum's gates. The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of wet leaves and decay. I climbed over the rusted gate with ease. The building stood shrouded in darkness, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at me. My chest tightened slightly, but I shook it off. The adrenaline rush of breaking the rules kept me moving forward. Inside, the air was musty and thick. Peeling paint curled off the walls like dead skin. My flashlight beam danced across graffiti-strewn hallways. "Hello," one spray-painted message read in bold red letters. Below it, smaller letters added, "Don't stay." A chill ran down my spine as I entered the main corridor. Doors lined the walls, some barely hanging on their hinges. I snapped a photo of the nurse's station, a hauntingly empty desk with a toppled chair beside it. A broken clock hung on the wall, frozen at 11:13. The farther I ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, and I began to notice odd details. Scratches on the walls, chunks of wood scattered like breadcrumbs, and footprints too fresh for comfort. I froze when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It came from deeper within the building, a steady rhythm like someone drumming their fingers on a table. My breath quickened. "Calm down," I whispered to myself, gripping my flashlight tighter. I followed the sound, my curiosity outweighing my fear. The tapping grew louder, leading me to what used to be the recreation room. My flashlight illuminated a piano, its keys coated in dust except for one, a single spotless key pressed down. I heard movement behind me and spun around, heart racing. "Hello?" my voice echoed, but no one answered. The silence was heavier now, like the building itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to laugh. "Stop freaking out. It's just an empty building." I continued to explore, snapping photos of decaying staircases and graffiti-covered walls, but unease gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, and the air grew colder with every step. On the second floor, I found the dormitory, a row of small claustrophobic rooms. Most were empty, but one door was ajar. Inside, I found a single chair facing the window. On the seat lay a crumpled piece of paper. Written on it were the words, "Leave now." My stomach churned. Was someone messing with me? I stuffed the note into my pocket, determined to stay calm. But the moment I stepped back into the hallway, I heard a loud crash from downstairs. It sounded like metal colliding with concrete. I bolted for the staircase, flashlight shaking in my grip. "Hello? Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The crash had come from the kitchen. I approached cautiously, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The kitchen door was slightly open. Inside, the shelves had toppled over, pots and pans scattered across the floor. My pulse thundered in my ears. Someone had been here, and they were close. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to move. I heard faint breathing. It was coming from behind the industrial freezer. I stepped closer, every fiber of my being screaming to turn around. "Who's there?" I demanded. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a whisper, "Help me." I staggered back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The whisper had been so faint, yet so desperate. I can't help you," I stammered, backing away toward the door. The freezer door creaked open slightly, revealing only darkness within. Fear consumed me. I turned and ran, nearly tripping over debris. I didn't care about the photos anymore. I just wanted out. But as I reached the front door, I saw fresh footprints in the dust. They led out of the asylum toward the woods. My car wasn't far, but every step felt like a mile. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached the car, I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but as I started the engine, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror, a shadow moving in the asylum's doorway. I floored the gas pedal, not daring to look back. My mind raced with questions. Who was in the asylum? Why did they leave that note? And most chilling of all, what would have happened if I had stayed a moment longer? When I got home, I locked every door and window, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I emptied my pockets and found the crumpled note again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before, numbers scrawled faintly on the back. It was a set of coordinates. My stomach sank as I typed them into my phone. They pointed to a location deep in the woods, not far from the asylum. My hands trembled as I stared at the map. What had I stumbled into? I reported the incident anonymously to the local police, leaving out the part about the coordinates. A week later, I read in the paper that the asylum had been searched. They found no evidence of anyone being there, except for a single chair in the dormitory, facing the window. I never went back to Riverton Asylum, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of that whisper, soft, broken, and filled with despair. Help me. I wake up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that somewhere, someone is still waiting for my answer. Next story. It started as a spur-of-the-moment idea, a solo road trip to clear my head after a breakup. The open road was supposed to be liberating, a chance to escape the heavy weight of my recent past. I packed my car with snacks, a playlist, and a map with a few key destinations circled. The first few hours were uneventful, just long stretches of highway and the occasional roadside diner. I reveled in the quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the engine and my music. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the quiet started to feel less comforting. I stopped at a gas station just off Route 12, the kind with flickering neon lights and a single pump. The attendant was an older man with leathery skin and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Heading far?" he asked. I nodded, paying for gas. "Be careful," he added cryptically. Shrugging off his comment, I got back on the road. It was just after sunset when I noticed the car behind me, a rustic green sedan keeping a steady distance. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but after 20 minutes, it was clear they weren't just heading in the same direction. I tried to shake them by taking a random exit, but they followed. My palms began to sweat as I turned onto a narrow, winding road. The sedan's headlights stayed in my rearview mirror, unwavering. "Relax," I told myself. "They'll turn off eventually." They didn't. When I reached a small rest stop, I decided to pull in and see if they'd pass me. Instead, the green sedan pulled in behind me. My heart raced as I pretended to check my phone, watching as a man in a hoodie got out of the car. He approached my car slowly, his face obscured by the shadows. I cracked my window slightly, just enough to hear him. "You dropped this," he said, holding up a wallet. My wallet. I instinctively checked my bag and realized it was missing. But how did he get it? "Where did you find that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He grinned, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Back at the gas station. Thought I'd do you a favor." Every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't just drive off without my wallet. I opened the door slightly and reached out to take the wallet. His hand lingered for a moment, gripping it tightly. "Be careful out here," he said, his voice low. "You never know who you might run into." Then he turned and walked back to his car. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I peeled out of the rest stop, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought I was free. But minutes later, the headlights reappeared in my rearview mirror. He was following me again, closer this time. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The road ahead was dark, flanked by dense trees. My GPS showed the next town was 30 miles away. "Just make it there," I told myself, trying to ignore the growing panic in my chest. The sedan suddenly swerved into the oncoming lane, pulling up beside me. For a brief moment, I saw his face calm, almost amused, as he motioned for me to pull over. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "Leave me alone," I screamed, though he couldn't hear me. He veered back behind me, flashing his high beams repeatedly. I spotted a turnoff up ahead, a narrow dirt road barely visible in the dark. Without thinking, I took it, hoping to lose him. My tires skidded on the gravel as I plunged deeper into the woods. The dirt road twisted and turned, each bend swallowing me deeper into the forest. I glanced in my mirror, praying I'd lost him. But there they were, those relentless headlights, cutting through the trees like a predator's gaze. The road ended abruptly in a clearing. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop. The green sedan pulled in behind me, blocking the way out. I sat frozen, my mind racing. He got out of his car again, this time holding something shiny. A knife. The sight of it sent a jolt of terror through me. "Stay in the car," I whispered to myself, locking the doors. He approached slowly, tapping the blade against his palm. "You're a hard one to catch," he called out, his voice eerily calm. Before I could react, he lunged at the driver's side window, slamming the knife against the glass. I screamed, throwing the car into reverse and flooring it. My car clipped his, sending him sprawling. I didn't look back as I sped back down the dirt road. I reached the highway shaking, every nerve in my body on edge. The green sedan was gone, but the fear lingered. I drove straight to the next town and reported the incident to the police. They took my statement, but I doubted they'd find him. Weeks later, I received a call from the police. They'd found a car matching the description of the green sedan, abandoned in the woods. Inside, they discovered a collection of wallets, all belonging to missing persons. My blood ran cold. I never took another solo road trip after that. To this day, I double-check my surroundings at every stop. Sometimes, I think about that man's smile and the way he seemed to enjoy the chase. I survived, but I'll never feel safe on the open road again. Next story. When I first moved into my new apartment, I thought it was a steal cheap rent, a spacious layout, and a quiet neighborhood. It was everything I needed after leaving my toxic ex. I was ready for a fresh start, eager to settle into my new life. The building itself was old, with creaky floors and walls thin enough to hear muffled voices from the next unit. My neighbor, an older man named Mr. Howard, introduced himself the day I moved in. "Welcome," he said with a crooked smile. "Let me know if you need anything." At first, I thought he was just being polite. He'd knock on my door occasionally, offering baked goods or asking if I needed help with anything. But his visits became more frequent, and his questions started to feel intrusive. "You live alone, right?" he asked one evening. Something about the way he asked made my skin crawl. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. After that, I started avoiding him. I'd wait until I couldn't hear his TV through the wall before leaving my apartment, and I ignored his knocks whenever he came by. One night, I woke up to a sound soft scratching, like nails on wood. My heart raced as I listened. It was coming from the wall next to my bed. "It's just an old building," I told myself, trying to calm down. But the sound didn't stop. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The locks on my front door seemed off. The deadbolt was slightly loose, as if someone had tampered with it. I brushed it off as wear and tear, but a nagging feeling told me otherwise. That evening, I ran into Mr. Howard in the hallway. "You should get those locks checked," he said casually, as if reading my mind. I froze. "How did you—" He shrugged, his smile unnerving. "Just something I noticed." I hurried past him without replying. I started keeping a chair propped under the doorknob at night, just in case. The scratching sounds continued, sometimes accompanied by faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the fear was growing. One weekend, I decided to install a small camera inside my apartment, aimed at the door. I didn't expect to catch anything, but the next morning, my blood ran cold as I reviewed the footage. Around 2 a.m, the doorknob jiggled, slowly, methodically. The door didn't open thanks to the chair, but someone had definitely tried to get in. I couldn't see their face, but I had a sinking feeling I knew who it was. I took the footage to the building manager, but he just shrugged. "Could have been anyone," he said. Frustrated, I called a locksmith and had all the locks replaced. For a while, things were quiet. Mr. Howard stopped knocking on my door, and the strange noises ceased. I thought I could finally relax. I was wrong. One night, I came home late from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped as I pushed it open. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like someone had been there. I called the police, but they found no signs of forced entry. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I started checking every corner of my apartment before bed, triple locking the door and keeping a hammer by my bedside. But the paranoia crept in, invading even my dreams. One night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't coming from the hallway or outside my window. It was inside the apartment. My heart pounded as I reached for the hammer. I crept out of bed, clutching the hammer tightly. The breathing stopped as I stepped into the living room. The shadows seemed to shift, but I saw nothing. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer, just silence. I barely slept that night. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my essentials and called a moving company, arranging to leave by the end of the week. But as I packed, I found something that made my blood run cold. Behind my couch, tucked into the corner, was a small hole drilled into the wall. Peering through it, I saw directly into Mr. Howard's apartment. My stomach churned as I realized he'd been watching me this entire time. I called the police immediately. They searched his apartment and found more holes drilled into the walls, as well as a collection of photos of me, taken through those very holes. Mr. Howard was arrested, but the damage was done. I moved out the next day, leaving behind the apartment and the nightmares it gave me. Sometimes I still feel the weight of his gaze, even in my new home. I double-check every lock, every wall, every corner, knowing that safety is just an illusion. Next story. The office wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I'd been working there for about a year, just another cog in the machine. My co-workers were mostly friendly, except for Derek. Derek was intense. He had this way of staring, like he was dissecting you with his eyes. At first, I chalked it up to his personality. Every office has its oddball, right? He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. His cubicle meticulously organized. Morning, he'd say, every day without fail, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. Things started to feel off when I noticed Derek taking an unusual interest in me. He'd hover near my desk during breaks, commenting on my projects. "You're really good at this," he said once, his tone too practiced, too rehearsed. It felt like a performance. Then came the emails, personal messages sent through the company server. At first, they were innocuous. "Good job on the presentation today." But soon, they grew stranger. "I noticed you left your desk at 3:47. Is everything okay?" I hadn't told him about my doctor's appointment. I confronted him one day in the break room. "Why are you keeping tabs on me?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Derek's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking out for you," he said. His words were meant to reassure, but they had the opposite effect. My unease grew when I started noticing little things going missing from my desk. A pen here, a sticky note there. Nothing significant, but enough to make me question my memory. Then, one morning, I found a photo of myself taped to my monitor. The photo wasn't one I recognized. It had been taken from a distance, through the office window. My stomach churned as I realized what this meant. I glanced around the office, but Derek wasn't at his desk. He arrived late that day, avoiding my gaze. I told HR about the photo, but they brushed it off. "Probably a prank," they said. "Don't take it too seriously." But I couldn't shake the feeling that Derek was behind it. His smiles were sharper now, more pointed, as if he knew I suspected him. One evening, I stayed late to finish a project. The office was quiet, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound. As I packed up to leave, I heard footsteps. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No response. I hurried to the elevator, my heart pounding. Just as the doors began to close, Derek appeared, his expression unreadable. "Working late?" he asked, stepping inside. I nodded, avoiding his eyes. The ride down was suffocatingly silent. When I got to my car, I realized I'd forgotten my phone on my desk. Swearing under my breath, I headed back inside. The office was dark now, the motion sensor lights flickering on as I walked. I found my phone, but as I turned to leave, I heard a chair creak. "Derek?" I called out, hoping it wasn't him. My voice trembled slightly, betraying my fear. I saw a shadow shift near the copier, but when I approached, no one was there. I grabbed my things and practically ran out of the building. The next morning, there was another photo on my desk. This one was taken from much closer, as if the photographer had been standing just behind me. My blood ran cold as I realized the photo was from the previous night. Someone had been there while I worked. I confronted HR again, but they dismissed it as a coincidence. "Maybe someone's trying to scare you," they said, laughing nervously. Their indifference made my frustration boil over. "This isn't a joke," I snapped, slamming the photo onto the desk. That day, I noticed Derek watching me more closely than ever. His eyes followed me everywhere, his expression blank but somehow predatory. I avoided him as much as I could, but it felt like he was always one step ahead. When I got home that night, I locked all my doors and windows, double-checking each one. I sat on my couch, staring at the photo. Was it Derek? Or was I letting paranoia get the best of me? Either way, I decided to quit the job. It wasn't worth the anxiety. My resignation letter was ready, but before I could submit it, I received an email from Derek. No subject, no text, just an attachment. Against my better judgment, I opened it. It was a video of me, taken through my living room window. I felt sick. How did he know where I lived? I called the police, but they couldn't do much without solid proof. Change your locks, the officer advised. I did, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Derek's presence loomed over every moment. My final day at the office was tense. I avoided Derek entirely, keeping my head down and finishing up my tasks. When it was finally time to leave, I felt a wave of relief until I found another note in my car. We're not done. I've since moved to a new city, changed my number, and cut off all ties with anyone from that job. But sometimes, late at night, I think I see a figure standing in the shadows outside my window. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I'm not so sure. Next story. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to disconnect and recharge. My friends and I rented a cabin deep in the heart of Redwood National Park, far from the noise of the city. No cell service, no distractions, just nature and each other. The first day was perfect. We hiked along scenic trails, snapping photos of towering trees and crystalline streams. By evening, we were gathered around the fire pit, laughing and swapping stories. The forest felt alive, vibrant, yet oddly watchful. That night, as we lay in our bunks, I heard a faint sound just outside the cabin. It was rhythmic, almost like someone tapping on the wooden walls. Probably an animal, I told myself, pulling the covers tighter. But the sound didn't stop. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to the group. "It's the woods," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "There's always something out there." We shrugged it off and spent the day exploring, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that we weren't alone. That evening, we ventured deeper into the forest, following an overgrown trail. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Then we found a clearing with a makeshift campsite. Empty, but clearly recently used. A rusted kettle sat over a long dead fire, and a weathered backpack leaned against a tree. "Someone squatting," Alex said, poking at the fire pit with a stick. But there was no sign of anyone, and the air felt unnaturally still. We decided to head back before it got too dark. As we retraced our steps, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. "You're being paranoid," I whispered to myself. Back at the cabin, we tried to laugh off the day's events, but the mood had shifted. Even Sarah, usually the skeptic, seemed quieter than usual. As we settled in for the night, the tapping sound returned, louder this time. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Alex, who was in the bunk across from me. He nodded, his face pale. We crept to the window, but the dense darkness revealed nothing. Then came a new sound: footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Panic set in. We locked all the doors and windows, huddling together in the center of the room. "It's probably just a deer," Sarah said, her voice unconvincing. "But deer don't knock on doors." And that's exactly what we heard next. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin, followed by silence. Alex grabbed a kitchen knife, his hand shaking. "Who's out there?" he called, but there was no response. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. We stayed awake all night, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, we stepped outside to find muddy footprints leading from the clearing to our cabin. They circled the building before disappearing into the forest. Against better judgment, we decided to stay one more night. "It's probably just some weirdo trying to scare us," Alex said. "If we leave, they'll think they've won." But his bravado felt hollow, and I could see the fear in his eyes. That evening, as we sat around the fire, I noticed something strange. A figure, just at the edge of the tree line. It was too far to make out details, but it was definitely a person standing perfectly still. "Do you see that?" I whispered. The others turned to look, but by then, the figure was gone. We debated whether to investigate, but fear kept us rooted by the fire. The night was eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, the knocks returned, more insistent this time. Alex gripped his knife, and I grabbed the fire poker. "We're armed!" he shouted, but the knocking continued, steady and unrelenting. Then, the doorknob began to turn. We rushed to barricade the door, pushing the couch against it. The doorknob stopped turning, but we heard footsteps retreating into the woods. "They're trying to scare us," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave." We packed our things and waited for dawn. As the first rays of light filtered through the trees, we stepped outside cautiously. The muddy footprints were back, leading from the tree line to our cabin. This time, they ended at the window by my bunk. We made it to the car without incident, but as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood in the clearing, watching us. Even from a distance, I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. We reported the incident to the park rangers, but they found no evidence of anyone living in the forest. The campsite we'd found was empty, as if it had never been used. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I doubt I ever will. Next story. Camping always felt like an antidote to my urban life. The noise, the deadlines, the constant barrage of screens, it all melted away in the woods. So when my old college buddy, James, invited me on a weekend hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I jumped at the chance. The trail was remote, far from the tourist-packed spots. James had picked it specifically for its isolation, a feature I initially appreciated. We drove for hours, leaving behind towns and cell towers until all that surrounded us were trees and silence. The hike started beautifully. The forest was dense and green, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streams. James, ever the outdoor enthusiast, led the way with confidence. I followed, enjoying the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot. As the sun dipped lower, the trail became harder to navigate. James checked his map frequently, muttering to himself. "Are we lost?" I asked, half joking. He waved me off. "Just a little turned around. We'll find the campsite soon." We didn't. The sky turned from gold to deep orange, then gray. By the time we stopped to set up camp, it was nearly dark. "We'll figure it out tomorrow," James said, trying to sound upbeat. I nodded, though unease had started to creep in. The night was eerily quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that made me feel exposed. As we sat by the campfire, James seemed tense too. "It's just the woods," he said when I mentioned it. "Nothing to worry about." In the middle of the night, I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, like a distant whisper. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, branches snapping, leaves crunching, as though something was moving just outside our camp. "James," I hissed, shaking him awake. He groaned but sat up quickly when he heard the noise. "Probably an animal," he whispered, but his eyes betrayed his doubt. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the darkness, finding nothing. Morning brought little relief. Our surroundings looked the same in every direction, endless trees and underbrush. "The trail should be this way," James said, pointing confidently. I followed, though the pit in my stomach grew with every step. After hours of walking, we found something odd. A clearing with a makeshift structure in the center. It looked like it had been made from branches and twine, crudely lashed together to form a small shelter. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James shook his head. "Someone's been here recently," he said, pointing to a pile of ashes in what looked like a fire pit. The air felt heavier now, charged with an unspoken tension. "Let's keep moving," he said, and I didn't argue. By midday, we were no closer to finding the trail. Our water supply was dwindling, and exhaustion was setting in. James suggested we rest, but I couldn't sit still. My mind raced with thoughts of the shelter and the strange, silent woods. As we resumed walking, the forest began to feel different. The trees were closer together, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of running water teased us from somewhere unseen. Then we found the shoes. A pair of hiking boots, neatly placed side by side in the middle of the trail. They were muddy, but otherwise intact, as though their owner had simply stepped out of them and vanished. James and I exchanged a nervous glance. "Let's keep going," James said, his voice tight. I wanted to argue, to demand we turn back, but where would we go? Every direction felt equally wrong. I followed him, trying to ignore the growing knot of fear in my chest. As the sun began to set again, the forest grew darker than it should have. It was as if the trees were swallowing the light. "We need to stop for the night," James said, his usual confidence now replaced with unease. We didn't bother with a fire this time. It didn't feel safe. As we sat in the dim glow of our flashlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made my heart race. Sometime after midnight, the sound returned. It was closer this time, circling our camp. I gripped my flashlight tightly, my palms slick with sweat. James motioned for me to stay quiet, but the sound stopped suddenly, leaving us in unbearable silence. At dawn, we packed up and started walking again, though neither of us had slept. The forest seemed endless, a maze designed to keep us trapped. I began to wonder if we were moving in circles, though James insisted we weren't. We stumbled upon another clearing. This one was worse. Bones animal, I hoped, were scattered across the ground, arranged in strange patterns. At the center was a small pile of rocks with something carved into the largest one. Neither of us dared to approach. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. James nodded, his face pale. We turned and walked as quickly as we could, but the forest seemed to shift around us. Every direction looked the same, and the trees seemed to close in. By the time night fell again, we were both on edge. The noises returned, closer than ever. James finally snapped, shouting into the darkness, "Leave us alone." His voice echoed, but there was no reply. Only silence, and then the sound of footsteps. We ran, abandoning the camp and plunging into the darkness. Branches tore at our clothes and skin, but we didn't stop. The footsteps followed, relentless, until finally, we burst out of the forest and onto a road. A passing car screeched to a halt as we stumbled into its path. The driver, an older man, stared at us in shock. "What happened to you too?" he asked. Neither of us could answer. We climbed into the car, too shaken to speak. As the car sped away, I glanced back at the forest. The tree line loomed dark and impenetrable, hiding whatever had been following us. I turned away, vowing never to set foot in those woods again. Next story. When I first moved into the apartment, I thought I'd found the perfect escape. It was cheap, tucked in a quiet corner of the city, and came with a balcony overlooking a park. After years of chaos in shared housing, this little one-bedroom felt like a sanctuary. The building was old, its walls thick with decades of paint and memory. I found the occasional draft and creaky floorboard charming. It had character, I told myself. The neighbors were quiet, almost too much so. I rarely saw anyone in the halls or lobby. It wasn't until the second week that I noticed something odd. I'd leave small things, keys, pens, a book on the kitchen counter, only to find them somewhere else when I came back. At first, I thought I was just forgetful. Then it started happening too often to ignore. One night, I returned from work to find my bedroom window open. The latch was broken, hanging loosely on one side. I hadn't touched it since moving in. I closed it quickly, telling myself it must have been the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to mention it to the landlord. Mr. Daniels was an older man with a stooped back and tired eyes. When I told him about the window, he barely reacted. "This building's got quirks," he said with a shrug. "Just keep it locked." The next night, I heard a faint tapping sound. It came from the direction of the kitchen. I froze in bed, straining to listen. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it started. I stayed awake for hours, clutching my phone, but nothing else happened. In the morning, I found a spoon on the living room floor. It had been part of a set I kept in the kitchen drawer. I stared at it for a long time, dread coiling in my stomach. There was no explanation, at least none that I wanted to consider. The tapping returned the following night. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I turned the corner, the room was empty. The tapping stopped the moment I stepped inside. I began locking every door and window religiously. Still, the sense of being watched lingered. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision or hear faint rustling when I was alone. My once cozy apartment now felt suffocating. One afternoon, I decided to check the building's history. The local library had old records and newspaper clippings about the neighborhood. That's when I found it, a report from 1973 about a tenant who vanished from my apartment under mysterious circumstances. The article was sparse on details, but it mentioned signs of a struggle and an unresolved police investigation. My apartment number was listed, sending a chill down my spine. I told myself it was a coincidence, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing fear. I started double-checking everything: locks, closets, even under the bed. But the disturbances didn't stop. One night I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, moving slowly down the hallway outside my bedroom. "Who's there?" My voice wavered as I sat up, clutching my phone. The footsteps paused, then retreated. My hands trembled as I called the building's security. They searched the halls and found nothing. Maybe it was a neighbor, one of them suggested. But I knew better. Desperate, I installed a security camera in the living room. I set it to record overnight, hoping to catch whatever or whoever was causing the disturbances. The first few nights showed nothing unusual, but on the fourth night, I found something. The footage showed a shadow moving across the living room. It wasn't mine. I'd been asleep in my bedroom. The shadow paused by the kitchen counter, then disappeared out of frame. I replayed the clip over and over, my stomach churning with dread. I showed the video to Mr. Daniels. He watched it with a furrowed brow but didn't seem surprised. "I'll have the locks checked," he said, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. His indifference only added to my frustration and fear. That night, I decided to stay awake. Armed with a baseball bat and my phone, I sat on the couch, waiting. The hours dragged by, and nothing happened. Just as I started to doze off, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were inside my apartment. I shot up, heart pounding. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer. I gripped the bat tightly, my hands slick with sweat. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, hoping to scare off whoever it was. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. When the police arrived, they found no signs of forced entry. They checked every corner of the apartment and assured me it was safe. "Probably just the old building settling," one officer said, but I knew better. Something or someone was in my home. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I loaded my car, Mr. Daniels approached. "You're leaving already?" he asked, feigning surprise. His eyes darted toward the building. Can't say I blame you. I drove away without looking back. A few weeks later, I read an online review of the building. The new tenant in my old apartment complained about missing items and strange noises at night. My blood ran cold. Whatever was in that apartment hadn't left with me. Next story. The open road always felt like freedom to me, a way to clear my mind and escape the monotony of daily life. This trip was supposed to be the same. No deadlines, no distractions, just miles of asphalt and the occasional gas station. But the stretch of highway I ended up on was far from ordinary. It was late afternoon when I found myself on Route 27, a road that seemed to appear on my GPS out of nowhere. I was heading to a small coastal town for a quiet weekend, but traffic on the interstate forced me to detour. The map suggested this would save me an hour. I'd soon regret trusting it. The road was eerily empty. No cars, no signs, just an endless ribbon of cracked pavement cutting through barren fields. A layer of mist clung to the ground, despite the clear sky, and the faint hum of my engine was the only sound for miles. I glanced at my phone for reassurance, but it had lost service. I chuckled nervously, telling myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd been in plenty of places without reception before. Still, something about the quiet felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. As the sun began to set, the shadows lengthened across the road, painting everything in shades of orange and gray. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. My stomach growled, and I made a mental note to stop at the next gas station or diner. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I slowed down. At first, I thought it was an animal crossing the road, but it wasn't. A figure stood at the edge of the highway, back turned, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. They didn't move as I passed. The sight unnerved me. I glanced in my rear-view mirror, but they were gone. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Just a hitchhiker," I muttered, trying to convince myself. Still, the image of their still, unmoving silhouette clung to my mind. A mile later, I spotted a small diner with flickering neon lights. Relieved, I pulled into the gravel parking lot. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, but I didn't care. I just wanted food and some reassurance that I wasn't the only person on this road. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The place was empty, except for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter. She barely glanced up as I slid into a booth. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. I nodded, scanning the faded menus tucked between the napkin holders. "Not many people come through here," she said as she poured the coffee. Her hands were steady, but her eyes darted to the window behind me. I turned to look, but all I saw was the empty parking lot and the darkening sky. As I ate my sandwich, the feeling of unease grew. The waitress seemed distracted, her gaze flickering between the clock and the window. When I asked if there was another way back to the interstate, she hesitated. "Just stick to Route 27, she said, almost too quickly. Back on the road, the headlights of my car cut through the encroaching darkness. The mist thickened, curling around the edges of the road like creeping fingers. My radio had been static for miles, but now it crackled faintly. A single voice emerged. "Turn back." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only static behind. It's a glitch, I told myself, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I turned the radio off and focused on the road, willing my pulse to slow down. Then I saw it again, the figure from earlier, standing by the side of the road. This time, they were facing me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding on the pavement. But when I looked again, they were gone. I gripped the steering wheel, my breath shallow. "You're just tired," I muttered, trying to shake off the growing fear. But I couldn't ignore the sense that I was being followed. The empty road stretched endlessly ahead, offering no comfort. A faint light appeared in the distance, a gas station. Relieved, I pulled in, my car rumbling to a stop. The pumps were old and rusted, and the station itself looked abandoned, but the lights were on. I hesitated before stepping out. As I approached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. Inside, the shelves were empty, and a layer of dust coated everything. A single receipt fluttered near the counter, held down by a small rock. Written on it in bold letters were the words, "Get out." My stomach lurched. I bolted back to my car, heart racing. As I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The road twisted and turned, the mist growing so thick I could barely see. Then, the figure appeared in my headlights, standing in the middle of the road. I swerved violently, my car skidding into a ditch. The impact jarred me, but I was alive. When I looked up, the figure was gone. Again. Shaking, I crawled out of the car. The silence was oppressive, the mist suffocating. My phone was still out of service, and the road was empty. I started walking, hoping to find help, but every step felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. After what felt like an eternity, headlights appeared in the distance. A truck pulled up, its driver a grizzled man with a wary expression. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, glancing nervously at the road behind me. "Get in." As we drove, I told him about the figure, the radio, and the gas station. He didn't seem surprised. "This road's got history," he said. "People disappear out here. No one knows why. Best not to ask too many questions." He dropped me off at a small motel on the edge of a nearby town. I thanked him, but his parting words stayed with me. "Whatever you do, don't take Route 27 again." I nodded, too shaken to argue. Inside the motel, I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each detail more unnerving than the last. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. When I finally worked up the courage to check my car the next day, I found it untouched, save for one detail. On the fogged-up windshield, someone had drawn a single, chilling word with their finger: "Stay." Next story. Working the night shift at Davis Market wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The store sat on the edge of town, near Route 29, where cars rarely passed after midnight. I liked the solitude, the hum of the refrigerators, and the occasional company of late-night regulars. Tuesday nights were the slowest. By 11 p.m., the aisles were empty, and the only sound was the distant buzz of a flickering bulb above the cash register. I just finished stocking the cereal aisle when my phone vibrated. It was a text from my manager. "Carl, leave early if it's dead." I considered it, but something about the emptiness of my apartment made me linger. It was easier to stay busy at the store, even if it meant mindlessly cleaning shelves or reorganizing cans. Besides, leaving early meant walking to my car through the unlit back lot, which I hated. At 11:30 p.m., a single car pulled into the lot. The headlights were blinding as they faced the entrance. I squinted through the glass doors, but the driver didn't step out. The engine idled, and the lights stayed on. I told myself they were just checking directions or making a call. 15 minutes passed. The car was still there. I felt a twinge of unease but stayed behind the counter, pretending to read a magazine. The driver never moved, and my imagination began to run wild. Was it someone casing the store? A lost traveler? Or something worse? Finally, the headlights shut off, and the car door opened. A tall man stepped out, wearing a hoodie pulled low over his face. He walked toward the entrance with slow, deliberate steps. I instinctively straightened up, my pulse quickening as the glass doors slid open. "Evening," I called, forcing a casual tone. The man didn't respond. He wandered toward the back of the store, hands in his pockets. I watched him on the security monitor, the grainy footage showing him moving between aisles, picking up nothing. Minutes passed. The man circled the store twice, still empty-handed. I decided to approach him. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, keeping my distance. He looked up, a nose who cast a shadow over his face. I could see his mouth, a small, unsettling smile. "No," he said, his voice low and rasping. "Just looking." He turned away and moved toward the refrigerated section. My gut told me something was off, but I couldn't pin down what. I returned to the counter, my eyes never leaving the monitor. At midnight, he finally grabbed a single bottle of water and approached the register. He placed it on the counter, and I rang him up. His total was $1.29. As I handed him his change, our hands brushed, and I noticed his fingers were ice cold. I tried not to flinch. "Thanks," he said, that strange smile returning. He walked out without another word, leaving the water bottle behind. I stared after him, confused. When I stepped around the counter to pick up the bottle, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the counter, where the bottle had been, was a photograph. It was a Polaroid, slightly faded, but the image was clear. It was me, sitting behind the counter, taken from outside the store. My reflection in the glass door stared back at me, frozen in time. I rushed outside, but the car was gone. The parking lot was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the streetlight above me. My chest tightened as I clutched the photo, my mind racing. How had he taken it without me noticing? Why leave it behind? I locked the store early, unable to shake the paranoia. Every shadow felt like a threat as I walked to my car. I checked the back seat before getting in, locking the doors immediately. The drive home felt endless, every passing car making my heart race. When I got home, I locked the door and windows, pulling the blinds shut. I examined the photograph again, hoping I'd imagined it, but there it was, my face, my store, my reflection. I shoved it into a drawer, determined to forget. The next night at work, I tried to convince myself it was a prank, a creepy one, sure, but harmless. I avoided the back lot and kept my focus on customers. But as the clock approached midnight, the same car pulled in. My stomach churned as I watched the man step out, bottle of water in hand. He entered the store, smiling again. "Forgot this yesterday," he said, placing the bottle on the counter. My hand shook as I rang him up, but I forced a smile. This time, when he left, there was another Polaroid on the counter. I didn't touch it immediately, my heart pounding as I stared at it. When I finally picked it up, my knees nearly buckled. It was a photo of me, taken in my car outside my apartment. I called the police that night, but they were little help. "Probably just a harmless stalker," the officer said, as if that would comfort me. "Call us if anything escalates." I went home, but I didn't sleep. Every creak of my apartment felt like a warning. The following night, I called in sick. I couldn't face the store, the man, or whatever game he was playing. I stayed home, blinds drawn, lights off. But around midnight, I heard a soft knock at my door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept to the peephole, my breath catching when I saw nothing but darkness. Whoever was out there was covering it. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. Silence. Then, a voice. Low, rasping, familiar. Forgot something. My blood ran cold. I backed away, grabbing my phone to call the police. When they arrived, the man was gone, but taped to my door was another Polaroid of me, staring through the peephole. The police took the photos as evidence, but I knew they wouldn't find him. He was always a step ahead, always watching. I quit my job the next day, packed my things, and left town. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one I had. For weeks, I lived in a new city, constantly looking over my shoulder. The photos stopped, and I began to feel normal again. But one day, as I unpacked an old box, I found a Polaroid I hadn't seen before. It was of my new apartment, taken from the street. I dropped it, my hands trembling. My phone buzzed, and when I picked it up, there was a text from an unknown number. Forgot something. I never stayed in one place for long again. Next story. When I took the subway after midnight, I expected quiet. I was heading home after a late shift, earbuds in, lost in thought. The fluorescent lights in the station flickered overhead, their dull hum adding to the silence. I noticed the train schedule board delayed again. I sighed and slumped onto a bench, checking my phone. The battery was at 5%. Great. The station was almost empty, save for an old man at the far end, his coat worn and patched. He seemed to stare at nothing, his hands twitching. I glanced at the time. 12:47 ambiance train was scheduled for 12:55. I tapped my phone nervously, scrolling aimlessly, but my eyes kept drifting to the man. His movements were erratic, like he was rehearsing a script only he knew. Finally, the distant roar of an approaching train broke the silence. The old man stood abruptly and shuffled closer to the edge of the platform. I felt a pang of unease as I stood too, instinctively keeping my distance. The train slowed to a stop, its doors hissing open. I stepped inside and chose a seat at the far end of the car. The old man boarded too, sitting 3 rows behind me. The car was nearly empty except for the two of us. The train began to move, its rhythmic clatter filling the silence. I tried to focus on my music, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, the old man was staring directly at me. I turned back quickly, my heart pounding. I told myself he was harmless, just some eccentric night rider. But his gaze lingered, unbroken, like he was studying me. I felt my palms grow clammy as the train sped through the dark tunnels. At the next stop, no one boarded. The old man didn't move either, though he seemed to shift closer without standing. I shook my head, chalking it up to paranoia. But then I saw something strange, his reflection in the window. The reflection showed him grinning, though his face in reality was blank. My stomach dropped as I stared at the glass. My mind raced to explain it, a trick of the light, exhaustion from the long day, but it didn't feel right. I glanced back again, and this time, the old man was standing. He was clutching something in his hand, but I couldn't see what. My pulse quickened as I realized he was slowly walking toward me, step by step, as if testing my reaction. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice firmer than I felt. He stopped, tilting his head slightly. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, almost like a warning. Then he turned and walked to the other end of the car. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me. Maybe he was just confused, I thought. But then the train jerked to a sudden stop. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting the car in an eerie half-light. I grabbed the pole to steady myself. An announcement crackled over the intercom. "Service temporarily halted. Please remain calm." I groaned inwardly. Of course, this would happen tonight. The old man, however, didn't seem fazed. He stood at the far end, still watching me. Minutes passed, and the silence became unbearable. I decided to move to the next car, anything to put distance between us. As I reached the door, I realized it was locked. Panic began to creep in. I turned back to find the old man was gone. I scanned the car, my heart racing. Where could he have gone? The doors hadn't opened. The windows hadn't shattered. He simply wasn't there anymore. The air grew thick, and I felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. I called out, "Hello? Where are you?" My voice echoed back mockingly. The train jerked again, and the lights flickered back to life. I swore under my breath and checked my phone. It was dead. I felt completely alone. Suddenly, I heard a noise of faint scraping sound, like metal against metal. It was coming from beneath the seats. My breath hitched as I crouched down, peering into the dark gap. The scraping stopped abruptly. I backed away, heart pounding. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A figure darted from one row to the next, impossibly fast. It wasn't the old man, it was smaller, hunched, almost insect-like in its movements. I stumbled backward, panic overtaking reason. The lights flickered again, plunging the car into darkness. I clung to the pole, my breaths shallow and ragged. When the lights returned, the old man was standing directly in front of me. "You shouldn't have stayed on this train," he whispered, his face inches from mine. Before I could respond, he turned and walked to the emergency door. He wrenched it open with startling strength and stepped into the tunnel beyond. I hesitated for a moment before following him. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, dimly lit by emergency lights. The old man was nowhere to be seen, but his voice echoed faintly. "Turn back before it's too late." I moved forward cautiously, the oppressive silence pressing down on me. The train doors hissed shut behind me, and it began to move again, leaving me stranded in the tunnel. I cursed under my breath, realizing my mistake. As I walked, the scraping sound returned, louder this time. I turned in every direction, but the tunnel was empty. My flashlight beam caught movement ahead, something darting into the shadows, faster than my eyes could follow. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my grip. Standing there was the old man, but his face was wrong, twisted into a grotesque smile that didn't belong on a human face. "Leave," he rasped, his voice layered with something inhuman. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. When I scrambled to pick it up, he was gone again. But this time, the tunnel felt darker, more suffocating. Desperate, I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing loudly. The scraping sound followed me, growing louder and faster. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I had to find an exit, any way out of this nightmare. Finally, I saw a ladder leading up to a service hatch. I climbed it as quickly as I could, my hands trembling. When I pushed open the hatch, I found myself back in the station where I had boarded. The clock read 12:55. The train was still there, its doors open. I stepped back, horrified, as I saw myself sitting inside, earbuds in, oblivious. The old man stood behind the glass, smiling at me. I blinked, and the train was gone, leaving only silence. I quit taking the subway after that night. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to try. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that scraping sound in my dreams. And when I wake up, I swear I'm not alone.